Lightning flashed in the air one after another, and the crowd that had gathered screamed and wanted to kill the intruder. Tsuyoshi Tsukishiro, kneeling among the beastmen, asked himself in horror, how did it come to this? Besides, he did not understand where he was. At this time, Ryota, raising his weapon, warned that divine punishment would befall the insignificant man who invaded their sacred land. For thousands of years, the lands of the beastmen had been isolated from the outside world, but for the first time in history, a man had come against them. The other beastmen warned that this was war, and noted that the man who broke the treaty had drawn the divine card upon himself. Until recently, the protagonist was in a cave, and therefore he was even more frightened by what was happening around him. The beastman kept shouting the word divine punishment over and over again, and he narrowed his eyes, sweating from the tension, and wondered if he was really going to die in this strange place. 5 hours ago, one of his comrades, approaching the food tent, warned him to finish eating quickly. He also added that he should not go anywhere alone, since there were 2 other teams here besides them, and if he slacked off, he would not even get a piece of metal. He looked at him in surprise and asked why so many people were going down to an ordinary C-rank cave. At the same time, he finished his noodles, and his comrade, sitting down next to him, noted that they were living in such a time, and now there were many people like them. They were not the only heroes, and as soon as he said these words, someone from outside the tent called out to everyone and told them to get ready, since the heroes were coming. The man stood up, offering the main character to go, and he began to eat even faster, answering that he understood everything. Soon the whole team had already gathered and came closer to the cave, and one of them noticed that the closer he got to this cave, the more uneasy he became. If a C-rank cave was like this, then one of the men was afraid to even imagine what an A-rank or S-rank cave looked like. They stopped near the very entrance to the cave, and suddenly someone's voice was heard from it, who noticed that it was quite strange, because there were several minions of darkness here. All the team members shuddered when they heard this voice, and soon, several heroes came out of the portal. The guy, looking at the girl who was a member of his team, noticed that they could easily get rewards. She also thought so, and the garbage men meanwhile drew attention to the fact that the heroes were very cool, and one of the men noticed that if he were a hero, he would earn a lot. His comrade warned him to stop talking because he was cleaning the cave since he failed the awakening test. At that time, the heroes passed by them, and one of the cleaners thanked them for their hard work and asked if they could go in now. The girl closed her eyes and said that they could indeed go. Shiyoshi also looked after the heroes and then headed into the cave with his comrades. After the heroes defeated the minions of darkness in the caves, the cleaners, who were not related to the heroes and were better known as scavengers, came to collect the remains. Before going through the portal, they covered their faces with helmets and then went into the cave. They lived in different worlds, and MC failed the awakening test due to his weakness, although he also really wanted to become a hero. When all the team members moved, one of them noticed that this C-rank cave was not that big. They had to work faster because they were short on time, and the cave would close in 4 hours. They were supposed to gather at the same place, and when one of the team members told about it, the others responded that they accepted this information. Soon, they were already exploring the surrounding area, and suddenly the protagonist screamed, because he found a piece of a shield. He got closer to it, and one of his comrades noted that this was a good sign and was glad that there would be at least something worthwhile. He assumed that the parents from heaven helped them. The protagonist assumed that this could really be so, and decided to look deeper, and the guy reminded him that he should not forget that they were meeting in 3.5 hours. The protagonist agreed with this, and thought that usually something worthwhile lies at a depth. He decided to take a closer look at it, and began to dig through the rubble. 3.5 hours later, he, once again stuck a shovel into the ground, thought that it was strange, because there was nothing in this place. It would be bad to leave with only one piece of the shield, and as soon as he thought about it, the others warned him that it was time for them to go. He agreed and shouted that he was almost done. However, he was in no hurry to return, since what he had found would not cover even a day of Karen's stay in the hospital, and he was sure that he had to find something. Suddenly, a little to the side, he noticed a well, and it seemed to him that it even smelled of treasure. He did not understand where the well came from in the cave, and went closer to it, noticing that it was dry, so there could be something valuable there. If he found a surviving object, he would cover all of Karen's hospital bills, and so he looked into the well and saw a skeletal hand sticking out of the ground, on the finger of which there was a ring. He cried out in joy when he noticed it, and with the help of the rope, he began to carefully descend into the cave, assuming that the heroes had not noticed these remains. He begged for forgiveness from the heavens when he took the ring off the skeleton, but cried out in joy when he finally took it, because it was a rare thing. He almost cried in joy, because such equipment helped improve one's status, and it was sold for a high price. He was sure that he had found a treasure. In the end, he decided to put on the ring, and later asked Nakazato to find out the level of it. He had to hurry, and before returning, he thanked his ancestors for this find. When he put the ring on his finger, he cried out in surprise, because it suddenly began to shine. Immediately after that, small thorns grew out of the ring, piercing his skin, and he flinched and cried out in pain, asking himself, "What kind of ring is this?" A system window suddenly appeared next to him, informing him that the infinity ring had recognized him as its owner, and from that moment on he would not be able to remove it or change its owner, and an endless passage was about to open. MC began to look around, not understanding whose voice he had just heard. Waves of energy suddenly began to emanate from the ring, spiraling, and he paid attention to it and asked what it was. Gradually the amount of energy increased, and the emerging portal began to suck him in, and he began to beg the others for help. One of the men was surprised when he heard a scream, and asked if that was really the protagonist screaming. He asked the others if MC hadn't arrived yet. He remembered that he had seen him recently, and the scavengers assumed that he had gone to inspect another place. They felt sorry that he couldn't become a hero, because he had tried so hard, and in the end they decided to wait for him, since they still had time. At this point, he only screamed louder, the light from the ring became blindingly bright, and the protagonist almost completely disappeared in this light. When he came to his senses some time later, he found himself in the captivity of the Beastmen as one of the criminals, awaiting his divine punishment near the altar. Apparently, the divine punishment meant a devastating lightning strike on the altar. The protagonist asked himself in surprise, was he really sent to the sacred land of the Beastmen? The Beast King, sitting on the throne, ordered the others to begin, and Ryota addressed the others, shouting that today they would hold a trial for 3 criminals. One of these criminals was their brother, who sold secret information about their territory to the elves and humans. The Beastmen began to shout that this was shameful, as well as disgraceful, and called this Beastman a traitor. Several Beastmen threw him onto the altar, and the rest began to shout that divine punishment would come for him. At the command of the Beast King, the criminals were to face divine punishment, and when Ryota said this, one of the Beastmen pushed the traitor onto the altar, and Ryota shouted that the hammer of the Divine King, surrounded by lightning strikes, would erase all their sins, and also added that no one had ever managed to escape from this altar of the realm of divine punishment. As he finished speaking, a powerful bolt of lightning hit the traitor Beastman directly, and he arched and screamed in pain. The other Beastmen began to shout even louder, proposing to punish the traitors and subject them to divine punishment. Ryota declared that the next divine punishment should befall the first human in history, who invaded the land of the Beastmen, isolated from the outside world for thousands of years. Since he declared war on them, he too had to be punished, because he had broken their agreement. The Beastman grabbed the protagonist, and he closed his eyes and asked them to wait, trying to convince them that there was some misunderstanding. He noted that he was there by chance and asked them to stop. He also told them that his sister was waiting for him, and since the Beastman did not react to his words, he continued to beg them for help. Eventually, one of the Beastmen punched him in the stomach, warning him that he had enough of talking. MC closed his eyes and began to cry, desperately exclaiming in his mind that he could not die. Karen needed him, and he was also sure that he was supposed to be a hero. He did not understand how things turned out this way. Meanwhile, the Beastmen carried him to the altar, and the others began to call humans pathetic insects and ask how a human could defeat a great Beastman. They ordered him to die, and they also wanted the divine punishment to befall him. He flinched, and after ordering the sinner to be punished, the Beastman pushed him onto the altar square. He screamed, then thought that he couldn't die in such a place. He pushed off the ground, managing to dodge the lightning bolt, and all the Beastmen flinched, shocked that he was able to do that. The Beast Girl, who was third in line for execution, was also surprised and even opened her mouth in shock, watching the situation unfold. Ryota asked, "Did MC really dodge the lightning of divine punishment?" He thought that it was unforgivable, but despite such indignation of the other Beastmen, the Beast King sat quietly and did not say anything, but only frowned, watching the protagonist more closely. In the meantime, he stood up and shouted that he refused to die here. However, the next moment, another bolt of lightning pierced through his body, and he screamed, and Ryota laughed and asked who said that the lightning of divine punishment only struck once. After that, he declared that it was the turn of the next traitor, and the Beastmen began to ask for divine punishment again, and two of them began to lead the girl to the altar. She noted that it was a futile struggle, and the protagonist, whose body was blackened by the lightning strike, mentally noted that he could not die here. Suddenly, the ring still on him activated the divine selection system of the Infinity Ring. The protagonist's body began to glow from within, and after a certain amount of time passed, the activation and identification of the system was complete. The ring began to work on creating an ideal physical form, and the Beast King shuddered, noticing that the protagonist was still alive. Retta was also surprised by this, and at the moment when another lightning pierced MC's body, he rose slightly in the air, and the ring had already completed the creation of the ideal physical form by 15%. The Beastman did not understand what was happening, and gradually the burnt part of the protagonist's body began to crumble from his body, revealing healthy skin. The process of creating the ideal physical form was completed by 40%, and from that moment, the ring began scanning and used the Divine Eye skill. The protagonist suddenly felt that something was calling him, and he headed forward, ignoring the lightning that hit him again and again. He began to climb the stairs to the hammer standing in the center of the altar, and the Beastman realized where exactly he was heading. The creation of the ideal physical norm was already 60% complete, and the ring used the Divine Consciousness skill, as well as absolute cloning. Everyone froze in shock, not understanding what was happening, and MC, whose body was almost completely exposed from the burnt crust since the creation of the ideal physical form was 80% complete, came almost right up to the hammer. Even Ryota trembled, and it seemed incredible to him, because no one except the Divine King himself had ever approached the hammer so close. The Beast King smiled in admiration, asking if MC was really trying to lift the Divine King's hammer. He actually grabbed it with his hands, asking the hammer if it was calling him. He managed to lift it, not understanding why the hammer was calling him. The creation of the ideal physical form was 100% complete, and the ring applied the special status of the Chosen One. When this happened, the protagonist raised the hammer, and all the Beastmen cried out in amazement, and he frowned and shouted in war, holding the huge hammer above his head. When he managed to do this, the Beastmen were even more amazed, and the hammer began to shine brightly, emitting even more lightning. It kept calling to the protagonist, and he decided to use its power. Soon the size of the hammer changed, and it became a suitable size for MC. He obtained the Divine Hammer and reached the 3rd level, but due to the lack of experience, the power of the Divine Hammer could not be activated. So now it was 0%. The special effects were unknown, and it was blocked due to the lack of skills, so MC had to become stronger in order to unlock the full potential of the Divine Hammer. The girl was amazed that a human could lift the Divine Hammer. Ryota thought it was incredible that a mere human could do something like that. They could not allow the protagonist to touch their sacred hammer. After all, even the great Beast King could not lift it. And he narrowed his eyes, asking himself, how did MC do this? Anyone who lifted the Divine Hammer would become the leader of the Beastmen, so Ryota believed that this was some kind of mistake. A system window with his status appeared in front of the protagonist, and he looked at his body in amazement and thought that for some reason he felt that he had become much stronger. When he read the information about himself, he was surprised because he found out that he had reached the 3rd level. He assumed that this was a divine selection system and thoughtfully looked at the system, studying it in more detail. And suddenly, Ryota landed behind him. He angrily called him a name, warning him not to touch the Divine Hammer with his dirty hands. The protagonist turned around, and the Beastmen were amazed that their great General Ryota had come closer to him. They believed that he would not allow him to act as he pleased, and asked him to help them regain the pride of the Beastmen. Meanwhile, Ryota admitted that he didn't know how the protagonist was able to avoid divine punishment and even lift the Divine Hammer, but he warned that he should return it immediately and accept his punishment. The protagonist was distracted from his words as the system showed him a new notification. He now had access to the passive skill Divine Eye, and it could reveal detailed information about any item, and its cooldown was 0 seconds. MC mentally shouted out the name of this passive skill, and with it he learned Ryota's name, his status as a general, his level 84, and that he belongs to the Beastman species, is a warrior and a great swordsman, and also uses a rank A Zanbato weapon. The protagonist realized that with the Divine Eye, he can actually see everything about his opponent, and he assumed that this was a feature of the system. Meanwhile, Ryota took out his weapon, asking how a lowly human dared to oppose him. He decided that he would let the protagonist die without suffering and attacked him, but he managed to dodge and asked him to wait, as there was some misunderstanding. He knew that he would never be able to defeat a level 84 warrior, so he froze, sweating from excitement. Meanwhile, Rada told him to shut up and take it, and he swung his sword to attack him. MC begged him to listen to him. He closed his eyes, turned to the side, and raised his hammer in front of him. Beast Girl shuddered, mentally noting that the protagonist's fate was not to be envied, because Reda was one of the 5 great generals of the Beast King, and even among the Beastmen, he was an incredibly strong opponent. She was sure that he would cut the man into pieces with one swing of his sword. When Ryota struck, a huge amount of dust rose into the air, but MC managed to block his quick strike with his hammer, although the force of it pushed him back some distance. And yet he, with his eyes closed and his jaw clenched from the effort, continued to try to stand in place. He himself was shocked that he blocked this strike. His arm stopped obeying him, and he noticed that the hammer he was currently holding was incredibly heavy. Ryota, meanwhile, was also surprised that he was able to block his attack with a hammer in his hands, and he admitted that he was lucky that the hammer saved him, but he shouted that this will not happen next time. The protagonist reminded that he already said that this was a mistake, because he is not from this world. He asked for them to listen to him, but Ryota was not going to listen to him, and ran to attack again, after which he grabbed him. He was going to throw him into the sky and finish him off with an earthquake, and swung to throw him higher. The protagonist suddenly noticed a system notification that the passive skill Absolute Colonization had been activated. This allowed him to select an opponent's skill and copy it, as well as being able to sense the opponent's heart with his hand. The cooldown was 0 seconds. But the protagonist could only obtain 1 skill in exchange for his own. He was surprised that it was a clone skill, and thought about how he should sense the opponent's heart with his hand. He assumed that in other words, he should also touch his opponent's chest. He clenched his jaw, reaching forward and touched Ryota's chest, who did not understand what had happened. The protagonist, meanwhile, flew into the air, and all sorts of skills that he could copy appeared next to him. He was surprised that there were so many, asking himself how he could only choose 1 skill. Ryota, meanwhile, asked in shock, what was he doing? He swung his arm to hit him, but at that time the protagonist finally selected the Sky Shaker skill, which was suitable for copying, but the strength of it was unknown due to the lack of a weapon. The protagonist assumed that it should be suitable for the hammer, so he decided to use it. Soon, he had already copied the skill Sky Shaker, and repeated that he could not die here. He used this skill and began to descend on Ryota to hit him, and he exclaimed that it was incredible, asking how he was able to use his skill. When the protagonist struck, dust and stone fragments rose into the air, and everyone flinched in shock and even opened their mouths in surprise. However, when the dust gradually cleared, Ryota, who had previously frozen and closed his eyes expecting the blow, was suddenly surprised, as it turned out that it did not hurt at all, but even pleasant. MC read the notification that, being on the 3rd level without a profession and a weapon, he was unable to damage the enemy, and in order to increase his effectiveness, he needed to improve his skills. He was surprised, not understanding what kind of nonsense this was. Meanwhile, Ryota raised his sword, running towards him to attack, and called him names, outraged that he dared to attack him. However, the Beast King suddenly ordered him to stop and jumped higher into the air to land in front of Ryota. Everyone was shocked as the Beast King himself went to attack, and the next moment when he landed, dust rose into the air. The protagonist closed one eye, as the flow of air that rose was quite strong. Soon, when the dust cleared, everyone noticed that the Beast King had dropped to his knees. The fact that this was the case only surprised everyone more, and the Beast King, meanwhile, as he stood up, assumed that the Divine Hammer had chosen Tsuyoshi. He was sure that this meant that the gods had sent them a sign. He walked closer to him, placing his hands on his shoulders, and said with a smile that for hundreds of thousands of years, MC was the first one to be chosen by the hammer. Afterwards, he turned to his people, noticing that no one could lift the Divine Hammer except for this man. The protagonist asked in confusion, and all the people froze, looking at the king in confusion. He waved his hand, confident that they should let the protagonist grow if he was truly the future ruler of the Beastmen. He shuddered, not understanding what was happening, and the Beastmen began to talk among themselves, remembering what the prophecy said. However, they were outraged by the fact that MC was not a Beastman. Ryota also noted that the protagonist was a human, and the king asked what was wrong with that. He asked, did the prophecy say that the leader had to be a Beastman? He believed that Ryota meant that they should ignore the future hope of their people, and he bowed and admitted that he was right, since the prophecy did not say anything about that. He wanted to add something else about what could happen if the protagonist was not a Beastman, but the Beast King was no longer going to listen to him. He turned to the protagonist and asked what his name was. He introduced himself, and the king warned that if he was willing to take on this burden, then they agreed. However, the protagonist was too weak now, so the Beast King told him that he should become stronger in a year and return here, and then they would see if he was worthy of being their leader. After that, he put a clot of magical energy on his head, warning that if he did not return in a year, then he would use this mark to find him and kill him. He was sure that his people would be satisfied with this outcome, and asked the protagonist what he would answer. He hesitated, not knowing what to say, and suddenly the girl shouted out that he agreed. He turned in her direction in bewilderment, and she offered him to become stronger and gain freedom. He noticed that she was supposed to be punished after him, and decided to use the Divine Eye skill. When he looked at her stats, he noticed that her name and status were unknown, level 72, species beastman, warrior with a dagger but no weapons. She then added that it was better to be alive, and suggested that he not miss the opportunity given by the gods. He asked himself in shock, was she really level 72? He did not understand how she could be so strong, and asked why they wanted to punish her. However, in the end, he was distracted from his amazement and smiled, thanking her for the advice. He realized that she was right, and this was his opportunity. He had to survive in order to return back to his world, and so he accepted the Beast King's offer, but with one condition. He wondered what this condition was, and the protagonist pointed his finger at the girl and said that she would come with him because she would be useful to him. She let out a surprised cry, and he mentally noted decisively that they were now even. Sometime later, he was already leaning against the wall, and mentally noted that judging by the voice he heard then, it was the infinity ring that started everything. He looked at the ring on his palm, and noticed that he could not take it off, but thanks to this ring, he gained these strange abilities. He did not understand how he should return to his world, but before he could continue to ponder this, the girl said that her preparations were complete. She called him master. And he was surprised when he heard it. She confirmed it and explained that she had decided to serve him and also called him her savior. He turned away from her to hide his true emotions and smiled widely because the fact that a cute beast-eared girl called him master was incredibly pleasant. However, when he turned back to her, he sheepishly remarked that it was nothing since she had helped him too. From that moment on, he suggested that they support each other. And so he felt that the division into masters and servants was inappropriate. She was embarrassed and warned him that he did not understand how much this meant to her. The thing was that he had given her a second chance, but no one had ever thanked her or protected her before. That was why she took his hand and asked him to let her call him master. She added that he had become her miracle and shouted that she wanted to dedicate her entire life to him. In the end, he allowed her to call him master if she wanted to until then. She cried out in joy, and finally she asked if it was time for them to go already. She pointed out that it was quite late and walked forward, and advising the protagonist to watch his step. He sighed, looking around, and thought that this other world was very amazing. However, he suddenly stopped himself from thinking such thoughts, outraged that he was thinking about something like that. He reminded himself that Karina was waiting for him, and suddenly the system sent him a notification that the endless passage was unavailable because the recovery time for it was 24 hours. He remembered that he fell into the endless passage and found himself in this world, and asked himself if he would be able to return back if he fell into this again. When the endless passage opened, he asked himself if he would be able to return back. When the portal gradually began to pull him in, he realized that he would finally return home, and at that time, his companion turned around, calling out to him. Meanwhile, he was falling into the portal and shouted that he knew it would not be a pleasant feeling. The light of the portal became brighter and brighter around him, and finally he found himself in the well where he was originally and asked himself, did he really return? He frowned, looking intently at the ring, and suddenly a system window appeared next to him. He cried out joyfully and clapped his hands as the abilities he had obtained in the other world were retained. His level was level 3, and although he had no profession, no weapons, and no skills, there was a hammer in the divine inventory of consciousness. He was surprised that the divine hammer was still there, and the system told him that the characteristics were available in both worlds, unlike items, and in order to use items from the other world, it was necessary to place it in the divine inventory of consciousness in advance. The protagonist understood that if the level was synchronized, then it was possible to increase it in both worlds. He was able to bring the divine hammer to this world because it was in the divine inventory of consciousness, and he was surprised by this. He suddenly realized what could happen to his status given his current level, but suddenly he was distracted as other scavengers came to the well and asked him what was wrong. They advised him to get out before the cave closed, and he asked what they were doing here. He did not understand why they waited for him for several hours, and he shuddered, asking himself what was going on. Such surprise was due to the fact that he spent at least 5 hours in another world, and he assumed that something was wrong here. One of the men noticed that the protagonist had been sitting here all this time, and he was glad that he found him, and advised him to get out. Another scavenger added that if the cave closed, he would be trapped. Soon, MC, using the rope, began to climb, and he realized that time had stopped. While he was in the other world, time did not pass, and it sounded like a manga plot to him. He frowned, assuming that time could also stop in the other world. He wondered who this infinity ring belonged to. Suddenly, when he climbed out of the well, he sighed, remembering something. One of his comrades who was helping him asked, "What happened?" MC smiled and asked if it was true that the awakening test was tomorrow. Sometime before, the protagonist, covered in blood, ran with Karen on his back. It was raining heavily, causing the asphalt to be covered in water, and when he stepped on the ground, even more moisture rose into the air, preventing him from seeing properly. He closed his eyes, trying to run even further, and at that time, the monster swung his arms, destroying the nearby buildings. Karen suddenly admitted that she could not feel her legs, and then asked if their mom and dad were okay. Another explosion raised a huge amount of dust into the air, and the protagonist froze, shaking. He opened his eyes wider, assuming that this simply couldn't be happening. He began to cry, remembering his parents, and looked at the huge monster that was very close. He bit his lip, and then ran, screaming loudly and not stopping crying. Suddenly, someone called out to him, warning him that he cannot stop. Nakazato stopped him, noting that otherwise he could die, and the protagonist calling out to him desperately reminded him of his parents, and Nakazato ordered him not to follow them, because otherwise he and Karina would be killed by the darkness. He advised him to calm down, because he cannot defeat the darkness. However, it was as if the protagonist did not hear him, since his parents were still in the place from which they escaped. The monster was already very close, and Nakazato, paying attention to Karen's legs, exclaimed that they should take her to the hospital as soon as possible. At this moment, Karina, calling out to MC, asked if he was really going to take the awakening test. She noticed that he had just returned from work today, and looked at him worriedly. The nurse standing in the hospital room noticed that Karina was being caring as usual. She commented that she should also rest more, and the protagonist asked Karen how she was feeling. He wondered if her legs still hurt. The pain in her nerve occurred regularly, so Karen needed to take medicine. However, despite this, she said that she was fine. The nurse injected her with medicine, and she flinched slightly, but said that although she could not stand up, she had already gotten used to this pain. The protagonist realized that she was suffering and activated the divine eye, which showed him Karen's condition. 80% of the nerve endings in her legs were destroyed by the rubble of the collapsed building, and there was no chance of natural recovery, and the probability of resuming walking without assistance was 1%. The chance of recovery was very low, and so the protagonist assumed that Karina was in great pain. He was sure that she should have lived a normal life, gone to school, had fun with friends, traveled, spent every day with a smile on her face, and since she was his only family, he did not want to see her suffer anymore. Soon, when he was already out of the hospital, he decided that even if the chances were close to zero, he would definitely get her back on her feet, since there was still a chance. He was sure that there must be a way, and resolutely noted that if he became a hero, he would be able to get more information and perhaps find a solution. In addition, it was not only about Karina's illness, because he himself wanted to live a dignified life, and therefore he was going to become the strongest hero. When he thought about this, he raised his hand, on which he was wearing a ring, up. Soon, he came to the building where the groups were testing their courage to take the awakening test. Some people had already taken the test, and the results of one of them showed that he was level 3 and had a combat power of 540. The evaluator congratulated the person who had passed the test on being a hero and asked him to take the hero emblem that was created based on his test results. The guy took it and laughed happily because he was now a hero. The woman next to him, smiling happily, wished him to reach rank C and suggested throwing a big party to celebrate. After that, the evaluator called the next person who wanted to take the test. It was Tsuyoshi, and the evaluator noticed that he was retaking the test after failing the first test. Once ready, he had to go inside and put his hand on the measuring device. To be honest, the evaluator doubted that the results had changed at all. MC warned him seriously that they would find out soon, and went inside the room where the measurement would take place. The boy awkwardly noted that if he failed the test once, the result would most likely be the same, because the device measured his experience with high accuracy. He had met many stubborn people like the protagonist before, but he still closed the door of the room and began measuring. The protagonist, approaching the measuring device, noticed that the last of the test subjects was assigned the third level with a combat power of 540 points. It was quite normal for the previous test subject to have the same indicators, and since the protagonist should now be a third level, he was sure that he should become a hero, but he was curious about how high his combat power was. He put his palm on the measuring device and decided that he needed to take this seriously. He activated the ideal physical form and pressed the device with all his strength, and this began the measurement of the hero. From how much effort he applied, even the ground shook, and the evaluator was shocked when he felt it. The device even started to emit sparks, and in the end it announced the results of the protagonist's research. His level was third, and his combat power was 5,400 points. The 30-year record of the third-level hero's strength was broken, and MC ranked first in combat power among the third-level heroes, and in second place was a hero with a combat power of 930 points. He was amazed that his combat power was 5,400 points, and it was 10 times more than the previous participant. He felt a surge of strength, but he did not expect that he had become so much stronger. He thought about it and looked at his palm, and then smiled in admiration and sat down, because in any case, everything was going according to plan, and he knew that he would become the strongest. He tensed his muscles so hard that even the veins stood out, but suddenly he was distracted and asked himself, what would be the power of the Divine King's hammer? He extended his palm and a flash of magical energy appeared next to it, and the system warned him that due to a number of reasons, the potential of the Divine King hammer could not be fully revealed, and forcibly using it would result in the expenditure of a huge amount of energy, and the duration of use would only be 1 second. MC realized that in his current state, he would only be able to use this hammer for 1 second, but he believed that this should be enough for measurement, and decided to look at how much his combat power had increased now. He looked at the hammer in his palm with determination, and then decided to begin, and placed his palm on the measuring device, activating the power of the Divine King hammer. The system notified him of the activation of this power, and the protagonist suddenly felt that all of his energy had evaporated in the blink of an eye. And yet, despite this, he frowned and clenched his jaw tighter, absorbing the energy emanating from the hammer into his body. He ordered the device to measure his power faster and tell him how much his combat power had increased. His body was covered in sweat from the strain, and a flash was concentrated in the air, which burst out of the building. The amount of energy that the protagonist used even shook the ground, and some people noticed the flash in the sky and began to ask what was happening. The device, meanwhile, warned that due to overload, energy measurement was impossible. After a while, everything calmed down, and the appraiser ran into the measurement room, exclaiming that the power had been cut off due to an overload. He warned that everyone should evacuate immediately and suddenly froze in shock, turning his attention to the completely exhausted protagonist standing next to the device. He asked him in a trembling voice, "Who is he?" Sometime later, the protagonist, walking down the hallway of the building, realized that he should not have underestimated this hammer, because he did not even expect that all his energy and power would run out in just a second. He decided that he did not need to use the divine hammer of the king now until he became stronger. However, at least now he was officially a hero, and so he smiled happily, continuing on his way. Soon, he was already standing on the training ground, and Gaia, the hero in charge of their training, warned the other heroes that their training would be difficult, so they should give it their all. He was a level 9 warrior, and his combat power was 1,200 points. All the heroes strongly agreed, and MC wondered if Gaia's amount of energy was only 1,200 points at level 9. He wondered what his own combat power would be at level 9. Gaia, meanwhile, thought in annoyance that instead of training these newbies, he chose to explore a D-rank dungeon. He shouted that tomorrow they would come to a D-rank dungeon, during which they would understand what job suited them the most. It was possible that they would even be able to obtain a low-level item, and everyone shuddered in amazement when they realized that they would be going down into a dungeon. One of the disciples asked a little fearfully, "Shouldn't they train a little first?" Another guy exclaimed that they should know their job before going down into the dungeon, and Gaia asked in annoyance, were they talking about training? He warned them that they didn't have time for that, as they had to practice their skills in real combat once they became heroes. MC was prepared for that, and Gaia reminded them that he had warned them that training would be difficult, and he had ordered them to leave if they weren't ready. He asked if they understood. They replied that they understood, and the protagonist noted that they weren't supposed to ask any questions but only follow orders. Gaia, as far as he could tell, was simply taking his anger out on them, since heroes were people after all. But anyway, A level 72 beast girl was waiting for him in the other world, and as soon as the endless passage opened, he was going to go see her. Sometime later, he returned to his apartment, and the news on TV began to tell that due to an earthquake that occurred around 7 p.m., some areas had lost power. But fortunately, there were no casualties. The protagonist noticed that time was up, and happily exclaimed that it was time to go to another world. There, he would become stronger, choose a profession, and collect the necessary equipment, and so he opened the endless steamship. The ring glowed, and he opened his eyes in another world, noticing that he was here again. The appearance was the same, even his clothes were preserved, and